This podcast is a Royfield Brown production. Find others on iTunes.
All right. Here I know.
Hello and welcome to Intelligent Speech. This is the show where I just do whatever I want, basically. I just like to get in front of people who I admire, people who've got something interesting to say, people who I like, quite simply. And it's been one of the joys of me being on Clubhouse for the last, 3-4 months, that I've bumped into one Steve Crone. Now, when we first met each other, I took an instant dislike to him because he professed a love of a football team, which is beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned. That football team is, of course, Chelsea FC. But putting that to one side, our second encounter, I made a massive faux pas. Somebody was talking about the film The Matrix, and I went, it's all style over substance, not much to it, and whatever. And somebody said, Steve, wasn't that one of the films that you produced? He went, yep. So that was our second interaction. But all that...
I'm not kidding. I have no memory of what you just said. I don't recall you saying anything even remotely negative. I only recall The Matrix coming up. But so that's so interesting. I have no memory of that.
I was utterly shamefaced. And I think it was Daniel that actually said, Steve, wasn't that one of your movies? But anyway, it was a wonderful introduction to the world of Steve Crone. Is somebody who seems to be somewhat of a polymath, seems to be a massive raconteur, not even seems to be, he is, a wit, a bon vivant. If ever there is a topic that Steve Crone doesn't have some level of knowledge on, it's not worth knowing. Steve sits across two branches of American life and culture, the law and entertainment. He's a producer, he's a lawyer, he's a professor, and he's a bloody nice bloke as well. Steve, are we friends? Because I was trying to figure this out earlier today. What is the definition of a friend in the world of social media? Because I think back in the day, you'd say a friend is somebody who knows, the name of your partner. It's probably been round to your house, or at least, works with you. I don't know the name of your partner. We've never worked together, though we have hung out together once at a bar. So are we acquaintances? Are we friends? What are we in this new digital social media age?
No, of course we're friends. And by the way, that's not a commentary on anything about this quote unquote social media age. If two people sort of follow each other on social media and have some kind of interaction, I don't think that would necessarily make them friends. But that has, like you said, what really happened with us is we met on Clubhouse. We interacted on some on Clubhouse. And now, we've gotten together. We chat off of Clubhouse. Of course we're friends. I don't think I'm saying anything profound about the world of social media, but we're obviously friends.
Well, here's the thing, right? Because specifically on social media, relationships can be asymmetrical. People can reveal a lot about themselves, or within the media or podcasting. So this is not necessarily a social media kind of comment. But I'm always struck when I do my podcasts and then I'll meet somebody. They will say something to me about one of my children. And for a second, I'm bamboozled. I'm like, how do you know that? But I've made some oblique reference in a podcast, some years ago, some months ago. And that person's remembered it. And I think we almost have an asymmetrical relationship because we haven't massively spent a lot of time talking to each other one-on-one. I've been in your rooms, you've been in mine. And there's not a level of performance, but there's a certain level of, what am I trying to say here? How can we quantify that in terms of a real relationship? Because it occurred to me today whilst doing these notes, I didn't know the name of your son, though I know that you have a son. I know that you've gone to naked spas with your son and his girlfriend. and you've driven
Actually, his cousin's my nephew's girlfriend, but close enough.
But there you go. So I know lots of things about you. And the question is, how much can I get to know about you and still not actually know you?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple strands to that. First of all, there are some people who indisputably would be described by just about anyone as friends. Take social media out of the equation. They met through work or some other sort of professional-based contact. And they've become friends, but it hasn't opened up into the realm of who are your children, some of that kind of stuff. I mean, so there's lots of kinds of friends, you know. I mean, there are friends with whom you're very intimate across every aspect of your life. Just as you say, you know, you may not know the names of my children. I think there are personal friends people have where they would undoubtedly say, yeah, oh, absolutely. She's a friend of mine. He's a friend of mine. And they don't know anything about your professional life. Oh, I think he's maybe a lawyer, or I think he teaches, or maybe he does something to do with movies, or maybe not even that much. That doesn't make them not friends. I mean, you know, there's just lots of different kinds of friendships on many different kinds of levels. I play football every weekend, as you know, with a group of guys. I've never socialized with any of them. 1 week after we played, there was a Champions League match on, and we all went directly to a nearby place to watch that game. With that exception, I've never socialized with any of them. So they're certainly not intimates. They don't know a lot about my life, but we talk about those things while we're warming up and whatever. I would consider them, you know, my soccer friends. They're not friends. It's just a very circumscribed sort of relationship at this point.
What bracket would you put Barack Hussein Obama? I take it he's not a soccer friend.
No, basketball is his sport. I would consider him a not at all close friend. We formed a friendship because we shared a mentor, Abner Mikva. You know, when Barack was coming up, his two big political mentors were Abner Mikva, who was a congressman from the Chicago area, and then a judge, ultimately chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. I worked for him after I graduated from law school. And he was also Bill Clinton's White House counsel for a time. And the three of us all found ourselves teaching at the University of Chicago at the same time. And that's how I met Barack Obama. And, you know, interacted with him a few times, attended a big presidential fundraiser. Oh my gosh, that's a story in itself. It was at Oprah's home in Montecito outside of Santa Barbara. Holy mackerel. That was a wild experience. So yeah, hardly a close friend, more than an acquaintance. I didn't shake his hand once, but yeah, it's not like he's a close friend of mine. I do know his kids' names though.
We need to go back. You need to set us in your family circumstance, because I know that you have an eccentric mother, and you've talked about her, and her name is Rhoda. And it's lovely when so I've got these two kind of bits of Steve. I've got the anecdotal. I've got the person whose number is on my phone, and I go into Dishwasher Diaries, and then I do an IMDb search, and it mentioned your father. And it occurred to me, I've never heard you talk about your father, only your mother and her social faux pas. So tell us about Ma and tell us about Pa.
Yeah, so first I just want to say, happenstance. I think I talk about my mom slightly more because there's more funny stories. But I do talk about my dad quite a bit too. He was also quite a character. And I talk a lot about, you know, what he did when I was growing up and its influence on me. So my parents truly were originals. I mean, I grew up in a Woody Allen movie, and I always say to people, this doesn't illustrate why they were so kooky, but nonetheless, everyone at a certain age thinks their parents are weird. And, when I was in junior high school and high school, that sort of, whatever, 12, 13 to 16, 17, 18, I would say to friends, if they were coming over, look, my parents are weird. And they'd be, oh, yeah, my parents are weird too. And then they would meet my parents and they'd be like, okay, now you win, Steve. We get it. It's hard to know where to start. I don't want to tell a bunch of anecdotes, but rather just try to describe them. My dad's first career was in show business. He was the MC and the entertainment director. He booked the acts at a very famous nightclub in Atlantic City called the 500 Club, which was run by Frank Sinatra's best friend, Paul Skinny D'Amato. So he grew up in that world around a lot of show people. He booked acts at the Catskills. He was a dandy, always very nicely dressed, got manicures, smoked a big cigar, was a real storyteller and a real comedian. In a way, he missed his calling. He should have been, these are old names that many people won't recognize, but he should have been Alan King or Shecky Green or Jackie Mason, who recently passed away. He really was brilliantly funny and a real character. So that was kind of his personality. My mom is just, oh my goodness, a live wire, no filter, would say whatever is on her mind. Sometimes it's was very entertaining. Sometimes it was shocking. But for the most part, people were kind of tickled by it because even when she said something that was really inappropriate, I think people generally felt like there was no malice there. There's just like there was a missing gene or something, and she just said whatever she was thinking, not to hurt people or to be mean, but just because that's the way her brain worked. And yeah, they were real originals.
So your father worked in the entertainment business, and I can only but imagine that you lived around stories and large personalities. How much of that do you think? Because you are that, Steve. You are a great storyteller. You're a raconteur, as I said before. How much of that do you think you absorbed, or was actually physically within your DNA because you're your father's son?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly I absorbed it. I don't know what the mechanism is, but yeah, I mean, I definitely got that from my dad. And it's funny because my parents had 3 children. We're all pretty close in age. My brother is 4 years older than I am. My sister about 1.5 years older than I am. And I would say of the 3 of us, it's not like we're carbon copies in that regard. I'm certainly the one who's most likely to be telling a funny anecdote. My sister gabs and gabs and gabs like my mom, but she's not so much of a storyteller or a joke teller. And my brother, the quietest of the 3. But yeah, I mean, I certainly picked it up from both my mom and my dad, not just the storytelling, but also I'm kind of loud. I'm kind of in your face a little bit. And that was definitely my mom, not my dad. I mean, my dad was more of a performer. My mom, it was just, like the burning bush. That's how she kind of moved through her day.
So you moved at the age of 12 from the East Coast to the West. Was this because your father got a new position within entertainment? Tell us why the family moved, and tell us about your first impressions of California.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of story in between. So I was born in 1964. Atlantic City was already well on down its slow decline from its height, whether that was, I don't know, the 30s or the 40s. It was a major beach resort, but by 1964, it was a shadow of its former self. The Miss America pageant still happened there. There were still tourists there, but it was sliding. So my father's second career was as an auctioneer, and he had already started doing some of that, even when I was born. So he ultimately became an auctioneer full time. some of the same skills, right? He was on stage entertaining a crowd, but just also, selling stuff. And he did that on the boardwalk. All of the moves after that were related to his career as an auctioneer. And we moved first to Las Vegas. He followed his closest friend, lifelong friend. They were born 3 days apart and were best friends most of their life. Also an auctioneer. He followed him out to Las Vegas. We lived there for a couple of years. Then we moved to Laguna and then ultimately to Los Angeles. And those were all moves related to my father's auction career, first working for others and then ultimately opening his own auction gallery in Los Angeles when I was 12. I left Atlantic City when I was 8 and we landed in Los Angeles when I was 12.
First impressions of California, because Los Angeles is going to be your home, and you're going to be in the middle of the movie industry. So I want to hear about that kind of first impression, and then Steve Crone, I want you to tell us about Californian Girls.
Oh man! So I wish I had more interest.
And here's the thing, Steve, because I've listened to you, right, and as open as you are in Dishwasher Diaries, there are bits of your life which you're very careful about, and girls and your emotional relationships is definitely one of those. So be as delicate as you can, but we need teenage Steve before you go off to law school and film school.
Well, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot in between. So first, when I moved to Los Angeles, I lived in a suburb, the far, depending how you think about it, west, I guess the far southwest corner of the San Fernando Valley. I didn't know about Hollywood. I didn't know what CAA was. I grew up in a suburb that probably wasn't wildly different than growing up in the distant suburbs of many other major U.S. cities, right? It's not like I didn't go to Beverly Hills High School and, my friends were all in showbiz and that sort of thing. To be blunt, that's probably a little bit more how my kids grew up. But I didn't know from any of that stuff. So it wasn't, it was California in terms of weather, in terms of culture and political sort of orientation. But in terms of like the idea that I sort of moved to Hollywood and was sort of immersed in the world of entertainment or something like that, not really. I took a bus before I could drive with a friend down to Hollywood and we would catch a movie in Hollywood Boulevard. I would do the things that you could do in LA, but I wasn't like some showbiz kid or anything like that. So I don't have too much to say about that. And it's funny, no one's ever asked. Sorry, do you want to ask
movies? But were you into movies then? Because this has been like 1976. Yes. So what we talked about.
I was into movies. No, I was into movies long before I ever got to Los Angeles. I always loved movies. My grandmother, I didn't mention this, my mother's mother moved in when my brother was born. And as I mentioned, he's 4 years older than I. And she lived with us until she died on October 30th of my senior year of high school. So my entire childhood, from birth to my senior year of high school, my grandmother also lived with us. And when I lived in Atlantic City, my grandmother used to take us to the movies. I think it was, 35 cents or something, 50 cents. So I've loved movies as long as I can remember. Loving movies had very little to do with moving to Los Angeles. I didn't become aware of film because of Los Angeles. And my interest was never particularly in movie stars or that kind of stuff. In fact, when I started working at Village Roadshow and my mom would know what movies I was working on, it might be, and we made movies with major movie stars. My mom would report to me. She loved reading the gossip, the National Enquirer and those kind of papers. And at that time, at least in my memory, they focused a little more on sort of celebrity gossip and not so much on, I was impregnated by an alien and that kind of stuff. And she would tell me about what was going on with somebody I was making a movie with us, and I would have no idea, and she would keep me up to date. So I always loved movies, but it really, I didn't love Hollywood or show business. I loved movies.
So you had no in. It's not as if when your dad and your family landed in LA, it was a case of, hey, this producer, that producer, he'd worked with this person and whatever.
Oh, no. In fact, it couldn't have been farther from that. My dad at that point was an auctioneer. Yeah, he still did some concerts and things like that, but it wasn't like he was connected in Hollywood. In fact, in I think it was in junior high school, maybe my first year of high school, I remember telling my parents that I wanted to do some acting. I wanted to go to some kind of acting school. And I didn't want to do it at school because by that point, I was a proficient student. So I was on a sort of certain track and, kind of focusing on drama classes and stuff like that just didn't feel right. So I said I wanted to do that outside. And my dad, we had friends in the industry, but mostly people who came to the auction gallery. And I still remember he asked Mike Connors, the guy who played Mannix on a television show that you're probably not familiar with, an American television show from the 70s. And he asked him, like, yeah, my son wants to go to acting school. Where should he go? He's a kid. And Mike referred me to Estelle Harmon, a famous, sort of acting coach, not just for children, but a lot of children and adolescents. And, I would take the bus down to Estelle Harmon Acting Studio on La Brea and, take acting classes. So, yeah, I mean, we knew some famous people, but no, my dad was not like some kind of tied in. I mean, literally, I didn't know what CAA was. I don't think I could have named like the major studios. When you meet Hollywood kids today, I mean, they know the names of the agents who run the agencies, the studio heads, I mean, they know the industry. That was not my experience at all. Not at all.
So how many acting lessons did you have? Because I'm taking it, Steve, that you weren't any good because we're talking about you becoming a producer, a lawyer, as opposed to a great actor.
Well, I basically did it for a summer because, during school year, it was just impossible to do. So, but yeah, basically I just did it for one summer and then, moved on to other things. I don't think I had any illusions I was going to be some kind of great actor.
Was it hard?
But it was fun.
Steve, it was fun, but was it hard?
Yeah, I think it is hard. I mean, I still remember Estelle. I haven't talked about this literally in, probably 35 years since shortly after it happened. But it was hard because it was very serious. I mean, in fact, as I recall, you would start out with monologues. Like the first thing you would do is you would start working your way through certain monologues. And for the most part, they were assigned to you. You didn't sort of look at something that you felt resonated with you or you felt like, I get this, I know how to do this. It was just like, here's monologue number one. This is what you're going to do in front of the class next week. And sometimes it was something that I felt like I could relate to, and sometimes it wasn't. I remember, in fact, you had to audition. And one of the things they asked in the audition was to act like you were drunk. I think I was probably 14 or 15. I didn't drink. I was not like a kid who went to parties at that age. I just had to act like what I thought drunk was based on what I had seen probably in TV and movies. I didn't know what it felt like to be drunk. So yeah, it was hard, but I liked it. And I'm so glad I did it because it was an early introduction into, how actors think and work and are trained and how they do what they do. Of course, I had other experiences later that gave me more of an understanding of that, but it was a great early one.
Also, I think it's instructive for me to try and understand you, that you are a born performer, but you take all of yourself into your performances, whether it is the Dishwasher Diaries, and I don't know whether when you were a lawyer, did you actually go into the courtroom?
Oh, no, 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 no. My whole legal career as a practicing lawyer is strictly a transactional lawyer,
Okay.
right? I do deal, someone's being hired to direct a movie and I represent them, that kind of stuff.
But that can be highly performative. Yes, you need to study and be prepped and to know what the parameters of the deal can be. And then you go in there, as hard as you can to get the best deal for your client. But you're acting there, aren't you? You
I think, you said you're acting, so you're asking me. Mm-hmm. I'm not, for the most part. I would say that maybe some people are. But going back to what you said about being a born performer, because I have thought about this. I think I am in a way, but in a very particular way. And I think Dishwasher Diaries actually is a perfect example of it. And that is largely to the extent that I'm in that sort of performance mode. It is almost always improvisational, right? I've given quite a few talks in my life in many different settings, from professional presentations. I was a law professor for 10 years to, a toast at a wedding or a bat mitzvah. And I don't prepare a lot. A few notes, a few ideas. I don't prepare. I don't rehearse. So I have a bit of this kind of performance personality. You're right. But really overwhelmingly in a spontaneous or improvisational way.
So I came into this by talking about acting, and then we've come on to performance. And the two are different, but there's a big overlap between the two. Do you actually truly switch off? Because I get the impression that the Steve that I hear on Dishwasher Diaries, or the Steve that I've spoken to a couple of times on the phone, the Steve that I met in the bar, is the same Steve. However, can you confirm that for me?
Yep, you are right. I would say, I remember a conversation I had once with the mother of a very close friend of mine in a cafe in Jerusalem, of all places. And she was a library science professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And we were meeting for only the second time. I had slept on the floor of her living room once during my first year of college when her son and I were doing a little road trip, a little hooky from college. And this was only the first time I'd really chatted with her. And it was her son was getting married to an Israeli woman. And she made this observation about me, and it's totally 100% spot on. She said, the one thing that you really, really can't abide in other people, the one thing that makes it hard for you to warm up to someone, is what you perceive as a lack of authenticity. Somebody who feels like there's a shell, or it can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's guarded. Sometimes it's insecurity. Sometimes it's just wanting to put on airs. There's lots of different forms that it takes. And that is spot on. And I really do honestly believe that the flip side of that is what you see is what you get with me. I'm kind of always like this. I'm doing a little bit of shtick, a little bit, when I play football. I don't have an alternate persona that I click into when I'm being an entertainment lawyer. I'm kind of the same person that I am. That's just the way I am.
If you don't like artifice in others, aren't you ultimately in the wrong profession?
Well, that's an interesting question. To some extent, yes. When I was a teacher, people used to ask me, what is the single most important quality that a film producer has to have? This is when I was teaching film producing students in film school. And I gave what is kind of a boring but very practical answer. I said, actually, the number one skill of a film producer is getting other people to do what you want them to do. And maybe that's the greatest skill in life. I don't know, for people who are successful. And I think that getting other people to do what you want them to do often involves artifice. Again, this is not the sense in what you meant the question, right? I think you were talking about the superficiality, etc. But that's the way I'm answering it. I'm not comfortable manipulating people or using artifice to sort of get what I want. It's not comfortable for me. Again, I think that's not quite the sense in what you meant the question, but that's my answer.
But how can that be true, Steve? Right. So if I'm looking at, according to IMDb, right, your time as the president at Village Roadshow Pictures. So it's The Matrix 1999. Analyze This, Training Day. Great film, by the way. One of the top 10 films of all time, Training Day. 2001, Ocean's 11, 2001, The Matrix Reloaded, The Matrix Revolution, Mystic River, Ocean's 11, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Happy Feet, Ocean's 13. And then it just kind of stops because you got too many ploys here. You must have had to make a lot of people do things they didn't want to do, that you wanted them to do, to have that level of success, whether it is negotiating down an actor's salary, whether it's getting a director to work some extra days on some reshoots. You're going to have to be deep into doing a lot of things which you say you don't like to do to have this level of success.
Well, I mean, first of all, you're giving me too much credit. The way you asked the question suggests that I put all those movies together, that I produced all of those movies. And again, that's, as we've chatted a little bit offline, that's just not true, right? I was the president of Village Roadshow Pictures. We co-made all of our films with Warner Brothers, or most of them with Warner Brothers, many of them with other studios. And there were individual producers, there are studio executives, there are creative executives at Village Roadshow. There's all sorts of other people involved in what I think are some of the situations and circumstances that you're imagining when you ask that question. And I have to say, there have been many, many times in my life when I've realized, not just in a business setting, although in a business setting, but others, that I'm not comfortable. This is my word. I don't know that it's the right word, but I'm not comfortable manipulating people. So I've always taken the approach of sort of transparency. This is what I see. This is what I'm trying to do. And is this something you want to do? Right? It's sort of like I've always felt strongly about a certain kind of autonomy in my relationships, professionally, personally. So I don't feel comfortable twisting people's arms or manipulating them. Wait, if I play 3-dimensional chess and think 7 steps ahead and say this thing to that person and this other thing to that person, and it will get back to them and la-di-da-di-da, that sort of manipulation or game playing is something that I'm not good at and don't feel comfortable with. And in that sense, I didn't fit in, because what I just described, I think that's, like I said, I think that's inherent to being an effective producer. Not that there aren't exceptions to the rule, obviously. And I think it's inherent to being successful in a lot of circumstances where you see the picture, you see the pieces, you see the things that you need to make happen, and you lay the groundwork and do what you have to do to make those things happen. You don't just go to people and say, hey, would you be willing to do this? You say, I need them to do it. Now let me figure out how I'm going to make sure that the answer is yes. And I have to say, that's just not the way I've operated in my life. And I think I probably would be more effective in certain things if I did operate that way, but I just never have.
So is that maybe one of the reasons why you left the movie business?
Yeah, I think it is. When I left Village Roadshow, I became a full-time professor for 10 years. And right, I mean, academia with it has its pros and cons, but it is, at least insofar as the teaching part of it goes, right? It doesn't have much of what I just described, right? I mean, maybe getting students to try and see what you want them to see, but I don't think that fits into the sort of rubric we were just talking about. I think it is part of the reason I became a full-time professor for 10 years. And I loved teaching. I loved interacting with students. It was a ton of fun. It enabled me, to travel to London every summer because I taught in London every summer. And I think that is part of the reason, actually. Yes. And then I got kind of bored and started producing just a few years ago.
So, but were you bored though, Steve? Because this is another form of performing, first off,
Totally.
So,
absolutely.
So why did you get bored? Was it because you missed the excitement of being in and around movies? Did you get fed up of just looking at spotty young 20-year-olds and the wide-eyed enthusiasm for life? Or was there another reason why you just became fatigued with the teaching?
Yeah, no, I think I became fatigued it's a very mundane reason. I was teaching. To some extent, I would vary things, but, I was teaching the same things a lot. And I always taught contracts. Contract law is sort of the foundational course. If someone wants to be an entertainment lawyer, it really does start with contract law. And I think I just got tired of teaching the same subject. There's a curve. The first time you teach a new subject, and I taught 4, 5, 6 different subjects over the course of my teaching career. First time you teach it, right? It can be rough, even if you know the material, because it's an you don't just get up and lecture typically in law school, although some law professors do. There's the so-called Socratic method where you're doing this questioning and this give and take. And the first time can be rough. I think by about the third time, if you have a handle on the material, you've probably reached sort of peak. And then you kind of operate at that level for a while. And then it starts to become a little boring, at least to people with a short attention span. When you teach contracts for the 7th time, it's almost like kabuki theater, right? Every question that can be asked, every wrong way of thinking that a student can, every sort of blind alley they can go down. You already see it when they say the first question, and you know how to steer them back. And so now it becomes totally performative, right? I remember I said I enjoy that sort of improvisational, spontaneous aspect. Well, when you're still actively working with the student to figure out where they're coming from and why they're not seeing it the way you want them to see it and how to steer them back, now I'm in that improvisational, spontaneous mode that I enjoy. Once I got out of that mode and it was like kabuki theater, we know everything that's going to happen, right? Then it just wasn't as fun for me anymore. And also I've had a very episodic career in general. I don't think I'm the kind of person who can just do the same thing for 20, 30, 40 years. I worked in advertising after I went to film school. Then I went to law school. I did the law thing for a while. Then I was a film executive. And each of those episodes has been 10 years or less. It just seems like every 10 years, if that long, I need to do something different.
We haven't really talked about you and the law.
Or California girls. Notice how you completely forgot that you had asked me about California girls, Steve, but I remember.
I hadn't. And that was going to be my last question. But you somewhat played three-dimensional chess with me, and you saw that I planted a seed and deliberately then ignored it. And I was going to say, Steve, why have you ignored Californian girls? And
I haven't. So and there.
You haven't. You are spontaneous. You like to live on your wits. That's what Dishwasher Diaries is fundamentally about. You can turn and pivot. If somebody throws anything at you, invariably you've got an anecdote or you've got some kind of handle on it. And even if you don't, you can give them the space to explain it, draw out the information, and then you can then properly engage with them. You're expert at that. If you so live on your wits and you love spontaneity, you like being in the moment, why were you attracted to law?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I'm not sure if I had it to do all over again, it's what I would have done. But I think the answer to your question is twofold. One, there's this thing they always talk about when you're thinking of going to law school while you're in law school about thinking like a lawyer. And for better or worse, even though I don't necessarily like to admit it, I do think like a lawyer. Law school was very easy for me relative to a lot of other people. And by that, I don't mean how, good my grades were or something like that. I just mean the experience, even for people who excel, of adjusting to the way law is taught in America and this idea of thinking like a lawyer, which is really kind of thinking like a lawyer and just kind of thinking like a law student, came easy to me. There wasn't a lot of friction. There wasn't a lot of grinding of the wheels. And so I think part of the reason was that I had an affinity for it. And I did find legal kind of thinking and legal kind of argumentation interesting. But the truth is that I didn't love being a lawyer. I like being a lawyer. And there are certain parts of it that I have enjoyed thoroughly. But when I just think of the span of years in which I've practiced law, and for most of my career, I have not. But I practiced law for a while before I went to Village Roadshow. While I was a professor, I reaffiliated with a law firm, and I still represent a very small number of clients for that law firm. It's not my favorite thing to do. And part of that is because the practice of law and learning how to be a lawyer are two very different things. So I think I did it in part because I had an affinity for it and part because I liked that way of thinking. But the truth is, what that really meant is I liked being a law student a ton, and I just kind of liked being a lawyer.
You're going to clerk at the Supreme Court, and I spend half of my year in the United States. And one of the things I'm always struck by is the veneration that Americans have for the Constitution, because that doesn't exist anywhere else. Nobody in Britain cares about the British Constitution. Germans don't care about the German. Italians ditto theirs, or Zimbabweans about theirs. But also there's a veneration of the Supreme Court, but also with the practice of law, which is definitely not British. Why do you think you Americans so fetishize about the judiciary and the Supreme Court before we come on to your time clerking there in the early 90s?
Yeah. Well, I think you framed it in terms of the Supreme Court, but you also obviously mentioned the Constitution. And I think it's really the Constitution that is driving what you're talking about. And then the Supreme Court is secondary to that. Because, of course, when people in the popular imagination think about the Supreme Court, they're usually thinking about constitutional law, which, of course, is a small part of the Supreme Court docket. And I think the reason is because it's so wrapped up in the birth of our country and the mythology of the birth of our country. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I think it's fair to say that, what we're all taught in school in terms of the story of the colonies, independence from Britain, the sort of failed period of the Articles of Confederation, culminating with the Constitution, right? That's the birth of our country. That is its founding, its core. And for people who have a conservative bent in particular, I think there's even a heightened kind of almost fetish about the Constitution and these ideas of originalism, which you've heard me speak about in other contexts, which I think are silly. But I think, putting politics aside, I think that's it. It's the story of the founding of our country. And the Constitution is just such a big part of that story. And the Supreme Court is this group of people charged with interpreting it. And also, not just true of Supreme Court justices, my last thought, but all federal judges, they're appointed for life. I mean, in good behavior, right? But they're appointed for life. I mean, it is the closest we have in American government to royalty. Everyone else elected or appointed, can be thrown out of office, elected out of office quite easily. Federal judges, unless they're impeached, which doesn't happen very often, they're there as long as they want to be there. And so I think that's the combination of reasons. Also, it's shrouded in mystery, which I think hasn't hurt it.
It's interesting you talk about impeachment and judges, because the first impeachment in the United States actually was for a judge in the early 1800s. Yeah. I need to understand how you felt going into working in the Supreme Court, because, as you've said, this is the closest that maybe America has to royalty. You're a young man walking into this august establishment. What did it even smell like, Steve?
It smelled a little musty. Yeah, it truly was a heady experience. I mean, I wasn't just lucky enough to get a job there, but my boss was William J. Brennan Jr. And, you know, he was one of, my greatest judicial hero. So it was partially just, oh my gosh, I'm working at the Supreme Court of the United States. And I think maybe even a little more than that, maybe even a lot more than that. It was, holy heck, I'm working for Justice Brennan. I mean, Baker versus Carr, one person, one vote, New York Times v. Sullivan, the actual malice standard in libel cases. I mean, you know, he's just a giant of American law, and also a wonderful, charming, just captivating man. It was great. And I have to say, I'll be honest, and this is not false modesty. I wasn't cut from the same cloth as most of the law clerks I was working side by side with. The year I clerked, two of the other clerks for other justices the same year are now Supreme Court justices, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. And I don't mean to single those two out, but most of the clerks, when they finish clerking, they go to work at fancy firms doing appellate law, arguing cases in appellate courts or the Supreme Court. They go into government, policy making. I mean, they do all that kind of stuff. I finished my clerkship, moved to Los Angeles, and went to work at a entertainment law firm, a very small firm that represented Steven Spielberg and Bob Zemeckis and Clint Eastwood and Ben Stiller. I mean, I wasn't exactly the prototypical Supreme Court law clerk. And the other thing I'll say about that, without trying to be too critical of anyone else or sound like I'm patting myself on the back, a lot of the clerks felt like the reason I'm here is because I'm one of the 40-odd smartest law graduates from, a year ago. You typically don't go straight to the Supreme Court. You clerk for another judge first. Whereas my feeling was happenstance, luck, kismet. I think my head was in a slightly different space than maybe some of the other co-clerks. I didn't feel anointed. I felt lucky and tickled.
Who was the most impressive, Gorsuch or Kavanaugh? Who was the most impressive person?
Well, I have to give a specific answer to that. The answer is I can't compare, and there's a very specific reason. Neil Gorsuch, like I, was hired by a Supreme Court justice who was retired. So when I started at the Supreme Court, Justice Brennan was already retired. And so the arrangement I had, which was literally the best arrangement of any law clerk, is half of my time, and by that I don't mean 50%, but notionally, I would spend half my time doing things for Justice Brennan, assisting him with law review articles. He was writing speeches. He was teaching a course at Georgetown. And I would spend the other half of my time taking a 50% load of case assignments from Justice Souter, who replaced Justice Brennan, who took Justice Brennan's seat. So I was just like every other Justice Souter clerk, except I was assigned half the number of cases of the other clerks. Neil clerked for Justice White, who was also retired, but he had a very different arrangement. Justice White was traveling around the country sitting by designation. Believe it or not, you can go into a court to argue a case in federal court and appeal in front of 3 judges, and one of the judges may not be a judge who sits on that court. She could be traveling from another jurisdiction, taking a 2-month vacation in Hawaii, and they can allow her to sit by designation on an appeal in Hawaii, and she's one of the judges deciding the case. Well, Supreme Court justices can do that too. And that's what Justice White did a lot. And so I didn't really get to know Neil very well because he was traveling, as I remember it, traveling a lot with Justice White to Colorado and other places. And he wasn't sort of around all the time. So I can't really compare them. Brett was working for an active justice, so he was always there. I remember him. And that's all I'll say about that. I do remember him.
Well, I reckon Neil Gorsuch seems like a nicer chap. Brett Kavanaugh, more problematic. What do you reckon, Steve?
Based on things other than my time at the Supreme Court, that seems to be clearly the case, but that's a low bar.
Right. We've gone on talking for much longer than I actually planned, so it's about time to say to the good audience, why don't you come up and ask the great man a question? But what's my last question to you, Steve?
Well, this thing about California girls, I mean, it's so boring. I mean, remember, I moved here, I got to Los Angeles when I was 12 years old. And here's the way I'll answer the question. Again, like everything else, it's just kind of who I am. Despite the fact that I moved here when I was 12 and left Atlantic City, or Margate to be more accurate, when I was 8, I'm very kind of East Coast in my, whatever, I don't know, my temperament, the way I come across. I mean, people assume I'm from New York. And I would say that carried over into the sort of women I was attracted to. So the sort of stereotypical, I guess when people say California girl, right, you think blonde and sort of, there's a certain set of assumptions about that. And I guess I would just say simply, that was just never my kind of girl. So even from my very youngest, romantic encounters as a young kid, I was never really attracted to California girls, if that has any meaning other than a woman who happens to be in California. That just wasn't my thing. So I don't know what else to say about that.
You've had an hour of me droning on, trying to find some questions that do honour to the intellect, the spirit, and the wit of Steve Crone, and I've run out of puff. So now it's your turn. Justin Higgins, ask your question, sir.
Thank you, Royfield. I'm very excited, actually, and I'm honestly excited to ask Steve a couple questions here. First one's going to be an easy one, Steve. Did Brett Kavanaugh like beer?
I believe he did, yes.
Okay. So that is consistent with his testimony. He wasn't perjuring himself in that way. No, but on a more serious note, having clerked for, 2 Supreme Court justices and experiencing the law at its really the highest level, and just walking in DC around the buildings, anybody who works in these buildings in Congress, I'm sure it's the same way in the Supreme Court, you get this sense of gravity and weight in what you're doing. Did you ever consider eventually attempting to be a judge? And if not, why didn't that appeal to you?
I mean, the short answer is for half a second. Just like when I was in film school, I went to USC Film School as an undergraduate. For half a second, I thought, I'll be a director. I think for half a second, I thought, I wonder if I would want to be a judge. I mean, I spent 2 years working for 3 judges. But I never seriously considered it because I think, I don't think I have the temperament for it. Certainly being an appellate judge is a very solitary existence, right? You spend a lot of time in your chambers with a couple of other people. You hear cases, but there's not a lot of human interaction. There's not a lot of team building. It's not my thing. And the other is, I don't think I would have enjoyed the sort of judicial craftsmanship, the work of putting aside how much human interaction it involves. Fundamentally, what does an appellate judge do? They decide cases and then they draft opinions. And the idea of that being a primary activity, of just sort of cranking out those opinions, no, not for me. Not for me. So I never seriously, right? It's impossible for it not to cross your mind, but I never seriously considered it.
And then, Royfield, if you'd be so kind, one more follow-up, Steve. I'm obviously an outsider to Hollywood, but we have this view, at least before the Me Too movement, I'm sure it's largely the same, unfortunately, that Hollywood is a very kind of white man-driven, patriarchal organization where the stars kind of treat those beneath them like crap, and a lot of, I don't know, illicit, nefarious things happen to those people who are just earnestly trying to climb up the ladder. Can you kind of shed some light on your experience in Hollywood, and if that is an accurate or just, an inaccurate trope of the industry?
Well, I think like most sort of stereotypes, it's accurate to a degree, right? It's obviously not some sort of fantasy. It might be a little bit of a caricature. I mean, I've met lots of wonderful people who work in all aspects of the industry, but in film, as in, it seems, just about every other aspect of, business and our society, we're seeing what an endemic problem the sorts of things you just asked about are. And so it's hard to, I'll be honest, it's hard to answer that question in a way that both reflects my personal experience, but acknowledges and honors what we all know to be a pervasive problem. I did not run across a lot of that in my career. I didn't. But again, I mean, like all anecdotal evidence of very limited usefulness. So, I think it is a huge problem. I think it's changing. Certainly in terms of representation, it's changing. I think in the executive ranks, in the decision-making ranks, in terms of what shows will get developed, what movies will get made, the sort of day-to-day work, maybe not all the studio heads, and it hasn't percolated up to that level yet. But I think great progress is being made on that front. In terms of harassment, both sexual and otherwise, I think that's harder and trickier, right, to root out. So I think it's getting better, but I still think it's a huge problem. But again, anecdotally, it is not, I don't have horrible experiences or things that I saw. And certainly it should go without saying, but it obviously doesn't. If I had, and I certainly ran across other kinds of impropriety, I did something about it. When I saw something that wasn't right, I acted, and I had enough power to be able to. But unfortunately, not everyone does.
Thank you for those questions there, Justin. Just on Hollywood, I've always thought, I think like most people, that Hollywood is this really liberal kind of institution. And the older I get, the more I've kind of realized, for me anyway, this is somewhat of a nonsense. This is a deeply conservative industry for no other reason than it's about the bottom line, fundamentally money. Yes, there is this element which is about creativity and to maximize that bottom line. there needs to be some level of kind of invention, which kind of leads towards new ways of thinking. But am I mistaken in thinking that Hollywood is fundamentally a very conservative network, Steve?
Well, I think the problem in that question is how you define the terms, right? When most people say Hollywood is liberal, what they mean is that the personal political orientation of most of the people, not anywhere near 100%, obviously, is what we think of as liberal / left in this country as opposed to conservative / right in this country. I think that's accurate. I mean, I think the perception that if you just go across industries, right? Film and television, law enforcement, insurance sales, right? And you just ask the question in each of those industries. Yeah, Hollywood is more liberal than most of the others that you'll ask about. Certainly not all of them. But at the same time, it's big business with lots of money at stake, like you said, and lots of people who love making lots of money. And so sometimes those people make decisions that are driven by something other than their values. I see a lot of that. And I have many stories. See, I don't have a lot of anecdotes about people being terribly mistreated or sexual harassment. But I do have stories about people making poor ethical choices and having to do something about that. That's quite common. And again, I don't think that's unique to the film industry. I think it's something I've been preoccupied with for a lot of my life, actually. Why is it that in organizations, especially business organizations, people will do things, people will make decisions that are unethical and that I don't think they would make in other contexts? What happens to them? Right? I don't believe that everybody who's in business is just a money-grubbing, unethical maniac. And so it just attracts those people and then they just act consistent with their values, which is not to say that I don't think that doesn't happen sometimes. But I think sometimes even people who have a good ethical compass, somehow the needle doesn't work when they get into these situations. And I think there must be people smarter than me studying that and trying to understand it. But I certainly saw it a lot when I was in business, and at times had to take rather severe action because of it.
It kind of came to my view that Hollywood is a deeply conservative kind of institution because of actually watching the Netflix series Hollywood, which kind of reimagines the 1940s, early 1950s. And at that time, there are a lot of gay actors in and around Hollywood, whether they're directing or writing, but they have to hide their sexuality in terms of the public persona. And that's what really made me realize that the entertainment industry could have actually been a real vanguard for change in America, and actually has abrogated that responsibility historically. And maybe focusing in on the late 40s and 50s is the wrong time because we have McCarthyism and the Red Scare. But definitely when that went, actors were still hiding their sexuality. People of color weren't. It was still almost like a closed shop. But I'm not knocking at the entertainment industry per se. I quite like movies.
Well, I'm just going to say everything you just said is accurate, but I think you answered your own question, right? In that time frame, the entertainment industry wasn't just conservative; it was reactionary and oppressive in ways that have improved to some extent. But yeah, I think asking about the industry today, not that some of those legacies aren't still relevant, but I think the Hollywood of 2021 is significantly different than the Hollywood of 1955.
Is long form TV killing the movies, Steve? Game of Thrones, fantastic. You get deeper writing, greater character studies. Is that killing the movies?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think movies are going anywhere. I think the death of to paraphrase, I always get it wrong. I can never remember if it's well, never mind. The death of movies has been greatly exaggerated, right? I forget, is that Will Rogers? The reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, or is it, I forget what author said that. But anyway, I think, look, the movie business is facing enormous challenges, no question about it. But the idea that movies are dead, the idea that there will be no movie theaters in 5 years.
No. I'm saying, is it killing? I didn't say, has it murdered?
No, I don't think it's killing it. I think it's changing it. And obviously there are a bunch of trends which I don't particularly like, right? And now let's be clear. We're talking about American cinema because world cinema is a much more complicated conversation. But, the big studios are making way fewer movies than they did when I was at Village Roadshow. The percentage of those movies that are tentpole, blockbuster, either superhero or some other genre that's designed to be for the masses, very expensive to make, must make a lot of money. That's one trend that obviously is crowding out other movies, at least insofar as they're being made by those companies. Obviously streaming is a very important development. And there are others, but I still think the idea of the feature film as the audio visual equivalent of the novel, where it's one experience, beginning, middle, and end. You're done. It's over. You read the last page of that book. Maybe this author's going to write another book. Maybe they're not. But that experience is still an experience that people want to have. And movies are still, in my opinion, the art form of the 20th century. And I think maybe at least a big chunk of the 21st century. And I don't think that wonderful series is killing that. It's having an impact. Changes need to be made. Maybe there'll be less movie theaters in the United States 5 years from now than there are now. Maybe they'll be doing some different things than they're doing now besides showing movies. But I don't think movies are being murdered. I think maybe they're being beat up a little, but they're going to be okay.
Cole Fells, you've been waiting on stage for some time.
Hey, this is a great interview. Thank you so much for this, Royfield. And I have two questions, and I have a comment to make on something that Steve had mentioned earlier. Steve, you said that something that I truly believe in. You said that the best thing that you need to learn as a director or as a producer is to get people to do their job. There's a author, his name is Cleon Skousen, and he poses the philosophical question, was what makes a leader great? It says, is it the calling? Is it the president? Is the president great because of his calling? Or is the president great because he gets people to do his job? Or anybody in any position. He talks about, he gives an example of a bishop in a church. He says, what makes a bishop great? He says, people doing the work. And why do they do that work? They do that work because they want to support the bishop. They have a love for their leader. And I just found that very interesting when you mentioned that. I have a question about the University of Chicago. Did you happen to take an economics class from Professor Milton Friedman? And if yes, would you have a story about him?
I did not. I think, I could be wrong, but I think now I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago for 1 year, and then I went back for law school. But I believe Milton Friedman was gone already. He may have been there when I was a college student, but I think even then he may have already been gone. So I did take an economics class at the University of Chicago in my first year there, but it wasn't with Milton Friedman, so no Milton Friedman story.
My second question is, who's better in one-on-one, you or Obama?
Well, I've never played basketball with Obama, although many of my classmates did. I didn't talk about this. I did not know President Obama when I was a law student, although he was there, not as a student, but he had some sort of teaching research fellowship, like very shortly after he graduated from Harvard. And that was at the University of Chicago. So there were classmates of mine who did play basketball with him. But I didn't meet him until, as I mentioned, when I went back to teach at Chicago and Judge Mikva introduced us. But watching him play, I'm pretty confident that he's better than me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this. This has been wonderful. Thank you again for this session. Really cool.
Dana.
Oh, I don't have anything to add. I just came up because you guys are some of my favorite people on Clubhouse, and I've really enjoyed listening to this conversation, getting to know you better, Steve.
Well,
it was Mark Twain, Steve, by the way.
I was going to, can you believe I couldn't think of Mark Twain?
I was getting
I was like, it's either Mark Twain or Will Rogers, but literally I couldn't get the name Mark Twain to come to my mind.
June, you've decided to join us. Why don't you ask a question?
Yes, I have a question for Steve. I never talk to him usually in the Dishwasher Diaries, but I was wondering, when HBO and the cable companies became kind of huge in Hollywood, had you ever considered, working along with them, making films with them, becoming a programming executive instead of being an independent producer?
I didn't personally. I mean, my path to Village Roadshow was so direct. I was an entertainment lawyer, and then I went to Village Roadshow because one of my clients became the chairman of Village Roadshow. And so I went over initially in sort of a business and legal capacity, and then sort of evolved into a general executive. So I didn't personally. I mean, I my entire time as a Hollywood executive was at Village Roadshow. So no, I didn't. I don't know what else to say about that.
I asked that because so many of the creatives at HBO were in fact lawyers. In fact, when I was there, the head of HBO was indeed Michael Fuchs was a lawyer. And I think subsequently several others. So
that's right. Several of the heads
seem to be a natural path. And you seem like an HBO guy to me.
Well, I certainly have liked a lot of their programming over the years. I think there was a time, in fact, when the head of all of the major studios were lawyers, all of the major film studios. This was back in the 80s or 90s. I think every single one was a lawyer. And I think right now, none of them are lawyers, I think. So yeah, it's interesting. I guess there are ways.
I think there are more marketing people who have become heads.
June, thank you for that excellent question.
You're right, Phil.
Oh, I don't know if you were stuck in the Matrix. Pun completely intended. Me saying that, considering we got Steve Crone.
Royford, I have to tell you, that has become the phrase for when, someone's breaking up. And it's so weird to me every time I hear that. Because, the Matrix just, I don't know, it has a different ring in my ear, I think, than most people's. And I just find it's almost distracting when I hear people say, oh, sorry, Bob, we can't hear you. You're stuck in the Matrix. And I don't know, it just flashes me back to, the late 90s and the early 2000s in a very weird way.
Last question from me, unless someone's going to jump up on stage. But Steve, do you think we could have learnt more about you from just watching you unpack or maybe pack your dishwasher, and we could have saved ourselves 1 hour and 25 minutes in the process?
Well, clearly, no. There's at least a chance you could have learned as much about me by talking about packing and unpacking the dishwasher for that long. But just watching me do it, now I think you'd learn almost nothing.
Steve Crone, this has been utterly wonderful. It's been a long time coming, sir. You are, as I said at the top of this show, one of the most captivating people on Clubhouse. It almost feels like this app was kind of designed for you. You're a wit. You've got a man of fearsome intelligence. You're incredibly gracious. You're kind. You're a great conversationalist. Thank you for coming on to Intelligent Speech and gracing us with a bit of your time.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, it's been great. Thank you for saying all those nice things. You're so sweet. And yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. I love it.
What I don't understand is why a man with your undoubted intelligence supports Chelsea. You know, that is the fundamental, that is your kryptonite, isn't it?
See, so you said you were going to close with California Girls, but you were saving this Chelsea haymaker for unbelievable. You're unbelievable. So look, here's what I'll tell you. European champions, my friend. Two-time European champions.
That cup.
Defending European champions.
They bought that trophy.
And
it's
by the way,
with little grace, with little class.
You know what this reminds me of, Royfield? And again, I didn't grow up in England. I haven't been a Chelsea fan for 57 years. And this isn't meant as a criticism, but it does I get it, right? You have this experience of this team from a prior, period. And that's a legacy for you that is just like, you can't get past that. This is a question for you and maybe to educate me. Do you look at the club today and say, this is in the fabric of the club? It's not about just history. For instance, like I know a lot of people who won't support Real Madrid, because that was Franco's team, right? I mean, whatever. It's just a bad association for them. They're not claiming anything about the current team or the people who run the team. So is your contention that there's just an ugly history there and therefore you don't want to associate yourself in any way with that team? Or are you actually making a commentary about the current organization? Does that question make sense?
Makes sense. Both. And that's the answer.
So you got to educate me about the latter, because the former, whatever. I mean, if it was, I came to Chelsea in a very organic way, and that kind of, I adopted them as my team. So you and I will continue to talk about this, I guess.
Yes. Steve Crone, thank you for coming on to Intelligent Speech. Thank you, Justin Higgins. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Coldfells. Thank you, June Winters, for asking a question. And also thank you for sticking around, as you have done if you've been in the audience for the last hour and a half. You can listen to this. This isn't just an ephemeral conversation on Clubhouse. This will be a podcast. I'll put this up in about a week or so time on the feed Intelligent Speech. So if you just type in my name, Royfield Intelligent Speech, that you'll see the podcast. And again, we've been honoured to have one of my best friends, because that's how we came into this. I asked, are we friends? And we're definitely, we are friends. We're mates. We're muckers.
Wait, Royfield, in an hour and a half, this is, if we've accomplished nothing else, in an hour and a half, we've gone from Steve, are we really friends, to I'm one of your best friends. That is an incredible accomplishment.
Steady. I says, we're friends.
Oh, well, you got to play back the tape. I think you said close friend. Play back the tape.
It's gone from best to close.
Well,
I might have many close friends.
You tell me what it is.
But listen,
I love this. This was a good thing, not a bad thing.
But I think kind of at the core of our conversation, the way that we started, is this question of relationships and how much do we truly know people? And a lot of it is what we glean back, isn't it? And the emotions that someone elicits within us. And you, my brother, elicit good emotions within me. So you are my friend. Thank you for that drink in San Francisco. And thank you for illuminating our company in the last hour and a half, sir. Thanks, man. That was awesome.
Right on. Thank you.